grade and under are dismissed for kids' church. Second grade and under. Praying that God also works with our youth boys who are at their retreat. God works and moves in a powerful way. You know, I had a blessing. One of our youth students came up to me on Friday and said, "Are you coming with me, Pastor Nate?" And I said, "Where?" The youth retreat, the boys' retreat. "No, I'm not coming." "Oh, man, that stinks." You know, that's pretty cool. The middle school boys, well, I guess this is a high school boy now, wants to hang out with me. I'm an old guy, you know, but it says something about our church, how God is raising up leaders and kids and youth that are passionate about Jesus. We're not looking just in our lifetime, we're looking generationally. And so continue to pour into our youth and our kids. Well, I'll be done talking. Today we're going to hear from Jeremy Myers, who's involved with Global Intervarsity, mission outreach, campus ministry at WVU. And I've known Jeremy a long time. Really haven't known him really that much over the last 25 years or so. But prior to that, we were in grade school together. He was a year ahead of me, and we share a lot of the same mutual friends, have a deep connection through our Alliance Christian School basketball team, the Cardinals. We were pretty impressive back in the day. We beat those Orioles really bad every time. The Hawks were tough, though. We still got the best of them, too. Anyway, Jeremy's a great guy, and I can't wait for you to hear what he's got to share with us from God's Word. So, Jeremy, go ahead and come forward, brother.
The Blue Jays either.
The Blue Jays.
Good morning, everyone. Just give me a second here to get set up with all my... Even with technology nowadays, it still goes back to having notes and stuff, right? So it's just... So as Pastor Nate said, I work with international students at West Virginia University. And right now our chapter last year was around 84 students from 24 different countries. We had 3 people come to Jesus and many more start Bible discoveries. But today, I wanted to talk with you guys about Zacchaeus the Marginalized. Now, a lot of you guys have, of course, grown up with Zacchaeus, going to Sunday school, singing that song, Zacchaeus was a wee little man. Come on, everybody. A wee little man was he. He climbed up in a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. And as he passed the Lord, he looked up at the tree and he said, Zacchaeus, come on down, for I'm going to your house today. For I'm going to your house today. Yes. Yes. That very same Zacchaeus. Now, looking at the definition of marginalized, as I'm waiting for my phone to update, I apologize for this. Marginalized is to relegate to an unimportant or powerless position within a society or group. Now, what does that have to do with Zacchaeus? Well, let's take a look at it. Luke 19, 1 through 10. I'll give you guys a second to... Oh, yeah, it's up there. I apologize. I keep forgetting. And he entered Jericho and was passing through. And behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich, and he was seeking to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not because he was small in stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." So he hurried and came down and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, they grumbled, "He has gone to be a guest of a man who is a sinner." And Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, "Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold." And Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, for he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." So let me set the stage a little bit for you guys. Jericho, as you know, in the Old Testament, was the city where the Jews walked around 7 times blowing the horns and the walls came down. But later on during Jesus' time, it was actually one of the busiest hubs of business because it was on the way to Jerusalem. It was some of the most fertile ground in all of Judea. And then there was a man there named Zacchaeus. And it tells us in verse 2 that he was the chief tax collector. Now, being the chief tax collector meant a few different things. One is that you were extremely wealthy. And you could hire other tax collectors below you. And that's what he did. He essentially hired out people to become tax collectors. But there was also a price to pay. And that you gave up your loyalty to the Israeli people, to the Jewish community, and became a Roman citizen. And because of this, he was despised by his own family, friends, as being a traitor to the Jewish people. So not only that, but according to Mediterranean standards at that day, he was less than 5 feet tall. And if you guys remember looking back in the Old Testament, when the Israelites were trying to find a king, and Samuel was asking them, "What are you looking for?" They always talked about this large, tall, handsome-looking man as king. And Zacchaeus was the exact opposite of that. Here's the interesting thing. So we look in verse 3. It says, "And he was seeking to see who Jesus was." Now, the scripture doesn't tell us why he was seeking Jesus. Maybe he had experienced Jesus before. Or maybe a friend of his said, "Hey, Zacchaeus, I just saw this guy named Jesus, and he just cured this person." We don't know. But we do know that he was excited and curious to meet Jesus. And I think this is something that we need to understand in our lives daily. Is that even though Jesus was not there yet, God was already moving in Zacchaeus. You see, we get so caught up in thinking that everything and sometimes I forget that. There's one example of a friend of mine 2 years back who was a conversation partner of mine. And we met to practice English, and it was great. But he never came to our Friday night dinners. We never had a spiritual conversation. And so I just thought, well, God, I'm just going to plant the seed, I guess. I don't know. And then during one of the last meetings of the semester, we had an Easter celebration. And during that Easter celebration, we did a call to faith, where we essentially asked students what they believed in the Easter story. And we had these cool little Easter egg, like pieces of paper that they could fill stuff out on. And so after they filled these out, I took them and started looking at them and seeing if there were any that wanted to make a decision to follow Jesus. And as I was flipping through, I saw his name, and I pulled it out, and it said, I want to become a follower of Jesus. And I was thinking to myself, I'd never talked to him about anything spiritual. We had never had any conversations about Jesus. Nothing. And so I pulled him aside and I said to him, can you just not their first language, I made sure that he knew what he was committing to. And he said, yes, I do know what I'm committing to. And it's because I talked to my grandmother just a little bit before I came here, and she said she was praying for me. I talked to my mom, and she said she was praying for me. And I was completely blown away. Because God is already and always moving, even when I am not there. The next piece in verse 4, it says, Zacchaeus ran ahead and climbed a tree. Now here's another very interesting fact about people in those days. If you were very wealthy, you never ran. It was very improper. Why? Because you were wealthy. And you were allowed to take your time. You didn't need to worry about anything. So seeing this man who had a fortune picking up his tunic and running and then starting to climb up a tree must have seemed extremely bizarre. And he had multiple options. He could have gone to a house and been on a rooftop. History says that because Jericho was so affluent, so wealthy, that there were plenty of rooftops along the road that Jesus took. But he didn't want a rooftop far away from Jesus. He wanted to climb a tree to be closer to Jesus. And so that sort of leads us into the interaction between Jesus and Zacchaeus, where in verse 5, Jesus says, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. Now, the first thing that catches my eye is that Jesus called Zacchaeus by name. And why is this so important? It's so important because if you look at outside of his disciples, very few times in the scriptures does he actually call somebody out by name. And not only that, it reminds me of the scripture where it talks about Jesus is the good shepherd, and the shepherd knows his sheep, and he calls them by name. And so a part of him calling out his name was letting Zacchaeus know that he cared and knew about him. That this wasn't just a general Now, see, during this time, it was considered extremely, extremely rude to invite yourself to someone's home. That was meant to be an honor by the host. Hurried off the tree, which would have been a very interesting sight, I think, and came down and received him joyfully. Now, going back to why did Jesus invite himself into Zacchaeus' home? And I think this is the beauty of reaching out to the marginalized. Jesus saw and knew that Zacchaeus was not a part of the Jewish community and was hated. And that Zacchaeus was not going to go and reach out to Jesus. So instead, Jesus reached out to him. And it took away all the pressure off of Zacchaeus. And it let everybody know that was following Jesus, including the Pharisees, that this man Zacchaeus was a part of Jesus' community. And we'll get into this a little bit later about restoration. But Jesus had some backlash. In verse 7, the Pharisees grumbled that Jesus spent time with sinners. And it must have been very difficult because they looked at Jesus and saw that he was a rabbi, a teacher, someone who knew the law. And according to the law of the Pharisees at this time, anyone who was considered a traitor or a tax collector was deemed unworthy or unclean. So his whole household was unclean. So Jesus was knowingly putting himself in a place where he knew that it was unclean. Why did Jesus do this? It was for radical transformation. And I've seen radical transformation. And I hope that you guys have seen radical transformation. Like, let me give you an example. A student of mine named Edmundo from Mexico. We were meeting in the car, driving to engineering as always. He turned and looked at me, and Edmundo, if you're watching this, I miss you. He said, hey, I want to pray to become a follower of Jesus. And by the way, just a little note, if any of you guys ever lead somebody to Jesus in a car, it's amazing. But after he made that prayer, and after he got baptized, he went home. But he went home with threats from his mother that he was not allowed to be there at the house. And so he told me this, and we sort of grieved together. And I didn't hear from him for a few weeks. And then one day, I just called him out of the blue on Skype, and I was like, hey, man, how are things going? And he's like, Jeremy, you wouldn't believe what's going on and what God is doing. He's like, my parents are in marriage counseling. I have found a church. I've been sharing the gospel with my brother. And now he's actually leading the youth in his church back at home, being a world changer because of his radical transformation. But let's look at the radical transformation in Zacchaeus. So Zacchaeus said in verse 9, behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. Now, the term, the half of my goods I give to the poor, there's a Greek term. It's didomi. Now, you're asking yourself, Jeremy, why are you spouting Greek to me right now? Why does that matter? And it's really simple. It's the present tense. It's not the past tense that said, Jesus, look at me. A while ago, I gave 50% of what I have to the poor. And it wasn't the future tense of, okay, Jesus, man, I see it now. And I want to give 50% of what I have to the poor. But it's present tense, where Zacchaeus stood up and said, at this moment, Lord, I give 50% of what I have to the poor. That is radical transformation. And he goes well above that. Jewish law said that for someone to be following the law, that they only needed to give 20% of what they owned. But because of this transformation, Zacchaeus decides to kick it up a notch to 50%. And not only that, but also in the same verse, he talks about paying back fourfold to anyone that he had wronged. Now, here's the interesting thing about restitution back in this day. For this kind of crime, the law stated that he only needed to pay back twofold. But because of his heart and because of this transformation, he made sure and clear that his intention was to pay them back twice as much, because he knew how wrong it was to wrong them. And because of that, we have redemption. So in verse 9, Salvation was given because of his heart change. Because you could see the transformation that had occurred. But Jesus does something even more beautiful. In verse 9, since he also is a son of Abraham. And that simply means that Jesus is now welcoming and restoring him back to the Jewish community. That he was no longer marginalized. That he was saying to everyone who followed him and who spent time with him, this man is a son of Abraham. He is once again one of us. How beautiful is that? Sometimes when we feel like we've got nothing to hold on to community-wise, and then being restored into that. And how important that was at that day to have that kind of community. So why is this important? Now, I told you before that I work with international students at WVU, and some of you go, that's great, Jeremy, that you work with international students, but what does this have to do with me? And my answer is simple. There are Zacchaeuses all over your neighborhood and your community. And you need to find them. But for my context, the way that international students are marginalized, 70% of them never see the inside of an American household. %80 of them never make a significant friendship with American during their time in college. 80%. That's terrible. There are 1,480 international students at WVU with 2 specific ministries for them. That's not enough. I wish I could love on 1,480 international students, but I can't. And so I need others to come help me. Just to put it into context also about other ministries. So for the other American students that are at WVU, I put 40 plus, but it's actually closer to over 90 Christian student organizations. And so we need that for international students. And why is this so important for international student ministry? Well, when they come here, they are the best of the best. And so whenever they get back to their countries, they're going to be the politicians, the professors, the CEOs, the ones making the big decisions. And if we create radical transformation like those with Edmundo, we are sending back students who are on fire for God and who are going to change their cultures. And that, to me, it just makes me so excited. And it should excite you guys too, that you guys are a part of this. Now, maybe some of you guys are saying, oh, Jeremy, I'm 70 years old. I don't know. Maybe I can't do anything. This is what I like to tell people. If you have a car, you have a calling. If you can cook, you have a calling. If you have a home to host people, you have a calling. But what does that look like? And what can we do? Well, you can develop a better understanding of the marginalized, both in the university context, but also within your own communities. You could maybe get some cross-cultural training. Maybe you can learn how to invite yourselves into other people's lives without adding another check in your life. Oh gosh, Jeremy, I've got my son's baseball on Tuesdays and my daughter's basketball on Wednesdays and my prayer group on Thursdays and my tea time with the ladies on Friday. I just can't do anything. And my answer to that usually is, do you eat? Do you go shopping? Do you go work out at the rec center? Do you love to play board games? Why don't you invite them to those things? Because it doesn't add anything to you. You're already doing it. And it means the world to them. Do you know how difficult it is? I'm going off topic a little bit, but do you know how difficult it is for an international, either a student or just an international in general, to live in Morgantown? The transportation here, I'll be nice about it. It is not very helpful at times. Thank you. And because Morgantown is the way it is, with Walmart's on the exact opposite sides and the Kroger's on exact opposite sides, it's really hard to get someplace. We get spoiled because we drive all over the place. It's not that easy. Or maybe they just want to have community. Maybe they want to learn English. Here's the best thing about international student ministry. You don't have to speak another language. Do you want to hear my extent of my language? Un poquito. Woting budong. Jiaozi, baozi, taozi. And most of the Mandarin was food, by the way, if you couldn't tell. But they want to learn English. And here's another great thing. We're Americans. Right? Yes? We've been in America for a while. That gives us a huge advantage because they want to get to know Americans. They're fascinated by us. And they're willing to take chances with cultural things, including going to church. You could also learn how to start or share spiritual conversations. And especially within the context of the marginalized in your communities? Jeremy, I'd love to do that, but my neighbor, I don't know what to do. Well, that's great. If you are willing, we can teach you. What about sharing the gospel in a culturally sensitive or relevant way? Relevant to those people in their lives. Or as I said earlier, the practical ways to meet the needs of the marginalized. It's amazing for those that are marginalized, that are in our community, and that are in our different neighborhoods, if you invite them to be a part of your family. Whether it's meeting together for your own small groups. I saw a big list of all the different small groups going on here. That's awesome. Or just inviting them over for dinner, play dates with children. Or the last, but definitely not least, is you can go and talk to people like Kristen Rexroad, who I like to call T-Rex Road. Or myself, or Pastor Sean, or Pastor Nate, about how to do this. Because we want you guys to see that vision, to see that call. And I really encourage you guys today, after this time, to really reflect on what God is whispering to you about the marginalized. If there's a neighbor, if there's a friend, if there's somebody in your community, if it's international students, you can make a difference. And we are all called to the marginalized. Thank you so much.
I went to Boulder, and I was involved in the state-sponsored tea time that they had and conversation. But it wasn't until I came here that I felt like I had a family. And so he was telling that to other international students that were coming to the group. And so they really developed a family. So thank you for doing that. If you guys would stand as we continue in worship and in response, if you'd like prayer for guidance, for direction, for healing, for whatever, we'll be here in the front. If you want to pray by yourself,